What became of the Sodder children, the brothers and sisters who vanished in a West Virginia house fire? Officials declared that the Christmas Eve inferno of 1945 was an accident, but their relatives believed otherwise, suspecting the blaze was deliberately set to cover up a kidnapping. For almost 40 years, motorists traveling along Route 16 outside Fayetteville, West Virginia, would pass a roadside billboard displaying faded photographs of 5 solemn, dark-haired youngsters. Beneath the portraits were their names and ages: Maurice, 14, Martha, 12, Louis, 9, Jennie, 8, and Betty, 5, accompanied by a haunting question. What happened to them? Were they abducted, murdered, or could they still be alive? Fayetteville was then, and remains today, a small community where hearsay often outweighed evidence. Even the most basic issue, whether the missing children had perished in the fire, was never agreed upon. The only undisputed fact was this: on Christmas Eve of 1945, George and Jennie Sodder and 9 of their 10 children gathered at home for holiday festivities. One son happened to be away that night. At around a.m., flames engulfed the house. George, Jennie, and 4 of their children escaped, but the remaining 5 were never seen again. George rushed back into the inferno, smashing a window to re-enter the 2-story dwelling and tearing a strip of flesh from his arm in the process. Inside, visibility was impossible through the thick smoke and flames, which had already consumed every downstairs space: the living room, dining room, kitchen, office, and the parents' bedroom. In a frenzy, he quickly took mental inventory. Baby Sylvia, who had been in a crib in her parents' room, was safe outside. Also out were Marion, 17, John, 23, and George J.R.B., 16, who had escaped the upstairs bedroom they shared, their hair singed as they fled. That left Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jennie, and Betty, who George assumed were still trapped on the 2nd floor, likely hiding in the bedrooms separated by a staircase now ablaze. Desperate, he dashed back outdoors, planning to reach the upper windows. But the family's ladder, usually kept leaning against the house, had inexplicably disappeared. He then decided to drive one of his 2 coal trucks close to the house to climb onto and reach the windows. Yet although both trucks had worked perfectly the day before, neither engine would start. In his desperation, George tried to scoop water from a rain barrel, only to find the contents frozen solid. Meanwhile, inside the burning home, 5 of his children were still trapped amid swirling clouds of smoke. He was so frantic, he failed to realize that blood was running down his arm and that his voice was raw from screaming their names. Marion ran to a neighbor's house to telephone the Fayetteville Fire Department, but no operator answered. Another neighbor, seeing the blaze, tried from a local tavern and got the same result. Finally, frustrated, that neighbor drove into town and located Fire Chief Faye G. Morris, who activated the department's version of an alarm, a chain calling system where one firefighter phoned the next. The station was only about 2.5 miles away, but the crew didn't arrive until 8 a.m. hours later, by which time the Sodder home had already collapsed into a pile of glowing ash. Back in those days, training was minimal. Longtime Fayetteville firefighter Steve Cruikshank told the Times West Virginian in 2016. Everyone was a volunteer, and equipment was scarce. George and Jennie assumed that their 5 missing children had perished. Yet when a quick search of the ruins on Christmas Day revealed no remains, Chief Morris suggested the blaze had been so intense it had reduced the bodies to ash. A state inspector concluded that defective wiring caused the fire. George later covered the basement in 5 feet of soil, planning to leave it as a memorial. By year's end, the coroner's office issued 5 death certificates citing fire or suffocation as the official cause. But doubts had already begun creeping into the family's minds. What if the children hadn't died at all? Marianne later recalled in a 1976 interview with the Raleigh Register, "During the fire, I kept watching the windows, but not once did I see any of the children. I never smelled burning flesh. People say you can smell it for miles, but I didn't." George Sodder, born Giorgio Soddu in Tula, Sardinia in 1895, had immigrated to America in 1908 at age 13. His older brother, who accompanied him, quickly returned to Italy, leaving George alone. The teenager found work on Pennsylvania railroads hauling supplies for workers, then moved to Smithers, West Virginia, where he started as a driver before founding his own trucking business hauling dirt, then later coal and freight. It was at a shop called the Music Box that he met the owner's daughter, Jennie Cipriani, an Italian immigrant who had arrived as a toddler. The couple married and eventually had 10 children between 1923 and 1943, settling in Fayetteville, where a small but active Italian community lived. Locals described the Sodders as among the most respected middle-class families in the area. Though George was outspoken about politics and world affairs, he avoided talking about his past in Italy, never explaining why he had left. After the tragedy, George and Jennie planted flowers on the site where the home had stood and began recalling odd events that had preceded the fire. A few months earlier, a stranger had shown up looking for hauling work. He wandered behind the house, pointed at 2 separate fuse boxes, and remarked, "This place is going to catch fire someday." The comment seemed peculiar to George, who had recently had the wiring checked by the power company, and it had been pronounced safe. Around the same time, another man had tried to sell them life insurance. When George refused, the salesman became enraged, warning, "Your house will go up in smoke, and your children will be destroyed. You'll pay for the insults you've made about Benito Mussolini." George was indeed vocal in his opposition to the dictator, and his views sometimes sparked heated arguments with fellow Italian immigrants. But he dismissed the man's outburst. Family members also remembered noticing, just before Christmas, a man parked in a car watching the younger Sodder children as they walked home from school. Just after midnight on Christmas morning, the household phone rang. Jennie answered to hear a woman's voice asking for someone unfamiliar. In the background, she heard laughter and the clink of glasses. Jennie told the caller she had the wrong number and hung up. Later, police traced the woman, who admitted it had been a mistaken call. On her way back to bed, Jennie noticed all the downstairs lights still on, the curtains open, and the front door unlocked. Marianne was asleep on the sofa. Assuming the other children were already upstairs, she turned off the lights, drew the curtains, locked the door, and returned to her room. She had just dozed off when she heard a sharp noise on the roof, followed by a rolling sound. About 30 minutes later, heavy smoke woke her again as it entered the bedroom. Jennie found it impossible to believe that 5 children could be consumed by fire without leaving bones or tissue. She even carried out her own experiments, burning bones from chicken, beef, and pork. Each time, she was left with fragments. Household appliances had survived the fire well enough to be recognizable, further deepening her doubts. A crematorium worker told her that bones persist even after 2 hours at 2,000 degrees. The Sodder home, however, had burned to the ground in just 45 minutes. A telephone repairman later said the lines appeared cut, not burned. The family also realized that if the fire were due to faulty wiring, the electricity would have gone out, but instead, lights glowed throughout the blaze. A witness claimed to have seen a man at the fire scene stealing a block and tackle, the same tool George used on his trucks. Could this explain why his vehicles failed to start? That man later admitted to stealing the tool, but denied any role in the fire. Later, when visiting the site, young Sylvia discovered a hard rubber object. Jennie remembered hearing the strange thud on the roof, George identified the item as resembling a type of napalm grenade used in warfare. Then came reports of sightings. One woman said she saw the missing children peering from a car during the fire. Another claimed she had served them breakfast at a roadside tourist stop the next morning, noting a vehicle with Florida plates. A third witness in Charleston said she saw 4 of the 5 children in a hotel a week later, accompanied by 2 men and 2 women of Italian descent. She described trying to chat with the children, only for the adults to silence them and glare at her before swiftly leaving. In 1947, George and Jennie wrote to the FBI requesting help. Edgar Hoover personally responded saying, "Although I would like to be of service, this issue seems to be of local jurisdiction and does not fall within the Bureau's authority." His agents added they would gladly participate if local officials approved, but the Fayetteville Police and Fire Department declined. The couple then hired private detective C.C. Tinsley. His inquiries revealed disturbing details. The insurance agent who had threatened George was part of the coroner's jury that had ruled the fire accidental. Records also showed this man had once worked for George and had raised the family's home insurance policy without their consent just before the fire. Tinsley also heard a rumor involving Fire Chief Morris. Although Morris had publicly claimed no remains were discovered, he supposedly confided that he had found a human organ in the ashes. He allegedly hid it in a dynamite box and buried it nearby. When the Sodders exhumed the box, they brought it to a funeral director, who examined the contents and determined it was beef liver, untouched by flames. Soon word spread that Morris had admitted placing the liver there deliberately, hoping it would convince the family to abandon their investigation. The fire marshal was either bribed, or they just didn't care. John, the Sodders' eldest surviving son, told the Roanoke Times in 1984. The family didn't know what exactly had transpired, but they were certain something wasn't right. Perhaps the fire was arson meant to mask a kidnapping. Some believed the Italian Mafia had abducted the children as retaliation for George's criticism of Mussolini. Others suspected human traffickers. As John put it, "We figured they may have wanted to take all of us. My brother and I barely got out alive. But you can't live it over again." For years, leads kept appearing. George once spotted a photograph of school children in a New York paper and became convinced one was Betty. He drove to Manhattan, but the girl's parents refused to speak with him. In 1949, the Sodders launched a new excavation at the site, bringing in Washington, D.C., pathologist Oscar B. Hunter. The dig unearthed several items, charred coins, a partially burned dictionary, and fragments of vertebrae. Hunter forwarded the bones to the Smithsonian Institution. Their report concluded, the bones consist of 4 lumbar vertebrae from one individual. The fused transverse recesses indicate the person was 16 or 17 at death. The maximum possible age was 22, since the centra normally fused at 23 were not yet fused. Therefore, the bones suggest greater skeletal maturity than expected for a 14-year-old boy, the oldest missing Sodder child. While not impossible, it is unlikely a 14-and-a-half-year-old would show such development. The Smithsonian's findings led to 2 hearings at the state capitol in Charleston. Governor Oki L. Pattison and State Police Superintendent Wee. Burchett told the family the search was pointless and closed the case. Authorities suspected grief was clouding the parents' judgment, making them see possibilities where none existed. Undeterred, George and Jennie put up the famous billboard along Route 16 and distributed flyers, initially offering $5,000 for information, later doubling it to $10,000. Tips came in from across the country. A woman from St. Louis claimed Martha was living in a convent there. A man in Texas overheard someone in a bar discussing the West Virginia fire. Someone in Florida insisted the children were staying with one of Jennie's distant relatives. George personally traveled to investigate each report, but always returned without answers. In the late 1960s, more than 2 decades after the blaze, Jennie received an envelope postmarked from Kentucky. Inside was a photograph of a man in his mid-20s. On the back was a puzzling handwritten note, Louis Sodder. I love brother, Frankie. Ill boys. The man bore a striking resemblance to Louis, who had been 9 at the time of the fire. Same dark curls, deep brown eyes, a strong straight nose, and the same upward slant to the left eyebrow. The family once again employed a private investigator and sent him to Kentucky. They never heard from him again. Fearing publicity might endanger Louis, they chose not to release the town name or the note. Instead, they updated the billboard to include the new image. Sometimes it's hard to sleep at night, always wondering, George told the Associated Press in 1968. If they wanted to get me, why did they take my family too? He added, it's like hitting a stone wall. We don't know how to move forward anymore. George died the following year, in 1969, without answers. Afterward, Jennie built a fence around the property and gradually added extensions to her house, creating barriers between herself and the world. Since the fire, she had worn only black as mourning attire, a practice she kept until her death in 1989, when the weathered billboard was finally taken down. The family's theories and legacy. The surviving Sodder children and grandchildren carried on the search. Some theorized that the Mafia had tried to recruit George, and when he refused, they retaliated. Others believed extortion demands had been rejected. Another possibility was that someone familiar to the children entered the unlocked front door, told them about the fire, and lured them away under the guise of safety. They may not have lived through the night, but if they did, and if Louis really was alive decades later, perhaps they never reached out simply to protect their parents. Sylvia, the youngest survivor, lived until 2021, dying at age 79. Until the end, she believed firmly that her siblings had escaped. In many ways, she grew up as an only child. Her daughter, Jennie told The Independent in 2022, "You have to remember, my aunts and uncles who remained after the fire weren't really present. 2 were away at war, and the others were already grown." Henthorne herself doubted closure would ever come. "Anyone who actually knew what happened would have been my grandparents' age by now," she explained. And I think the story has been publicized enough that if the children had wanted to reconnect later in life, they would have made contact.